rules are going to look like, so you're not caught at the very end, you know, actually trying to get ready. So people are anticipating those changes.
Definitely. I mean, I agree with Jeff, Bill, and Corey. I think everything makes sense. I think even though the rules aren't final, it seems that most of the customers we speak to have a pretty clear assumption on some key themes. We might not know the details, but most people will agree that there's going to be more electronic execution and that there's going to be some form of clearing for that. Details are yet to be figured out, but most people agree on those sort of two pillars. And so off the back of that, we've seen, as Bill talked about, a huge increase in just pure derivative e-trading. Customers are out there looking at what the solutions, what solutions are available in the market, and as they're looking, they're deciding to try and use it now. So, we've seen probably a 3 or even a 4-fold volume since, a 3 or 4-fold volume increase since a year ago. So people are looking at solutions to see, can I electronically execute? Can I have pipes to all of the clearing venues that are out there? Because at this point, I don't know which ones I may want to use. And I think the last point is obviously, most of you are being courted by all of your DCMs. So you're going through that review process where you're comparing, contrasting DCMs and clearing offerings as well. So I'd say the headline is just a huge increase in volume.
I'd say one other thing that's kind of interesting, and it's not a U.S.-centric aspect, but the entire kind of global capital markets is going to follow the lead of this sort of, at least the G20 countries have committed to clearing. So as I'm getting more involved in sort of international initiatives for the CME, I'm finding kind of different themes arising in the global economies as they try and figure out what the implications are for clearing for us. What is it for, how am I going to be intermediated? Am I going to have my own clearing solution in my own country? Am I going to be intermediated to a global clearinghouse by the large dealer banks? Things like these are the questions that are arising, as even though things don't seem to have changed much, they actually have. This kind of whole meme of clearing, it's kind of, people assume it's going to happen, and they're trying to figure out in their own markets what the implications of that are going to be.
And volumes of CDS on U.S. Treasuries are up, so that's a change. I guess that's unrelated. Took everybody a minute. So Bill and Nathan, you guys both mentioned that you're getting new clients and there's new user types. Can you give us, and you obviously not going to talk names, but can you give us an idea of maybe the client type that are growing, or the demographics of where that growth is coming from? Is it hedge funds? Is it more banks? Where is the growth?
Sure. I'll go first, perhaps. I think probably today people are interested in probably mostly fixed income, I think. So there's some slightly different themes going on in the CDS and the rate space. A year ago, there was no electronic trading of CDS available of any sort of significance. Now, a year later, just about every single dealer has an electronic presence on the Bloomberg. And so that's something that's become available because of legislative context or legislative pressure. So that's a huge change, and what that's meant in terms of client types is your standard client type, so your hedge funds looking for relative value, your money managers that are looking to execute and show or prove best execution, and also a lot of the sort of smaller regional bank clients that are looking to trade or hedge bond issuances on the other side. So really a broad cross-section of the buy-side community.
And I think one thing, if I could just add, I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things that we were talking about before the panel earlier is, I've been on a lot of client meetings with all different types, from hedge funds up to asset managers, and what seems to be a common theme is a lot of the buy-side clients have set up these sort of CEF readiness paddles or clearing SWAT groups where they're bringing in people from different areas of the organization. So I think that's it's a change from what we had seen previously, where the front office not necessarily talking to the back office, not necessarily talking to the middle office, but now it's kind of all hands on deck. They're even bringing the lawyers into the meeting. For better or worse, so it's an interesting time, but you're seeing it across, from the largest organizations down to the two-man operations across the board.
So, beyond this, the obvious sort of systemic risk reduction and transparency goals of Dodd-Frank, another was to theoretically level the playing field in the OTC derivatives and the swaps market. So how will the barriers to entry change? And I think that applies differently to clearinghouses, to CEFs, and then to being a swaps dealer. So I don't know, we can take that from any of those angles first, but how will barriers to entry change? Are they up? Are they down?
Yeah. I'll start. I mean, the answer really is a little of both. It's very clear, as Kevin says, there's a very clear mandate for equal access, and all of us, where there's clearinghouses or CEFs, there's a great demand for equal access, transparency. The rules haven't quite been set yet on what capital requirements there should be for membership in clearinghouses. There's clear direction from the regulators that those capital requirements have to be reduced to allow more people into the market to offer clearing services to the buy side and to members. So we're clearly seeing that. At the same time, there's significant capital costs and investment required to participate in these markets. There's haircuts that clearing members have to take on the margin that they post with the clearinghouse that affects kind of the cost to them of doing business. We're not a CEF, but we certainly hear from the execution venues that they think the cost of compliance is going to be much higher than it might have been just to offer an electronic trading platform for these products a few years ago, because of compliance and transparency and other regulations. And so the investment necessary to do that is going to increase. And I think finally something that's going to be challenging for a number of participants in the market is that the delay in implementing all of this, the delay in implementing it means there's not going to be the mandatory clearing experience, so there's just not going to be as many flows, for certain of the participants. It sounds like business is great for Bloomberg and Tradeweb, but there's a lot of these execution venues, these CEFs out there, and they may have to go another year before they start to see any kind of mandated volumes. And I think it's going to be hard for all of them to get through that. So I think in some ways we'll see more participants, but then I think the ones that stay in, the investment in compliance and sort of competition for flow is probably going to reduce the participation of some of them.
I think those are great points, Jeff. I wholeheartedly agree with all of those. But I think also, if you look at the market participants and exclude the sort of, us, the technology kind of people, if you look at the current liquidity providers and the current liquidity takers, I think what you're seeing on the traditional sell side is a case where, in the past you may have had to have a huge balance sheet in order to be able to have the counterparty credit profile such that somebody can trade against you. So we're finding now a lot of smaller shops are looking to provide liquidity because all of a sudden now, whomever you trade with, the credit is equalized because you're essentially facing a clearinghouse. So on the sell side or on the liquidity provision side, we're seeing a lot more shops that in the past have shied away from providing liquidity. We're seeing them all very interested and gearing up and moving to provide liquidity, and all sorts of from not just in New York but in Chicago and all sorts of places. So I think that's a huge shift. Whether it will crystallize fully, I don't know, but it's definitely a huge shift. And I think on the buy side, there's definitely a number of institutions that in the past have not internally been able to justify entering into a swap, a bilateral swap with a dealer, and incurring potentially some initial margin and some of that risk profile. Whereas now, because again, credit is equalized, and because they're getting daily margining, and it sort of sounds like a future, they're getting a lot more internal buy-in to potentially trade as well. So on the buy side, I think you're getting more people coming into the market as well.
Sure. Phil?
Yeah, I just add to echo what Nathan is saying there. I think as well as acting as both a swaps dealer and as a clearing broker, I think it'll take a little longer on the execution side for the model to change and CEFs to come in. But we are certainly finding on the clearing broker side is with the delays in the rulemaking, it's giving a lot of buy-side firms the opportunity to educate themselves more. I think there was a kind of a rush to go pick FCMs back probably 6 months ago and to try to work with existing relationships. So I think as the market kind of evolves and as the buy side gets more educated around what do you want from a clearing broker and how do you differentiate from that, I think there's a lot more meetings going on that I'm seeing right now to understand what the difference is and potentially change before the rules and legislation comes in.
Well, I mean, that's a very good point, and it brings up the question of then what is a dealer in the new world, right? So if, as Nathan mentioned, some of those new entrants where they want to be executing, a lot of them are sort of very technology-focused trading firms. If they're making markets and swaps electronically, are they dealers? Is that the same thing as what Wells or Bank of America will provide? And should they be regulated the same? And what is a dealer? What will that be? What does that mean?
I'd say in terms of being a swaps dealer right now, again, I think it's going to evolve over time. I think right now a big issue is liquidity. So I think ultimately it's going to follow more of the equities, the electronic trading, the equities model, where it sort of moved from more large blocks and dealing specifically with individual dealers to more of an anonymous type of market. But what I would expect it to evolve is more on a electronic request for quote sort of service coming in sort of as next, and then it to evolve into a central order limit book equivalent type of service over time. But I think all of that's going to be driven based on liquidity and based on the open interest.
I was just going to say, I mean, the use of the term dealer and executing broker, and I think that we're seeing with the evolution within the CDS market, I think you're going to see some of these legacy terms actually fall out of favor because there really isn't a definition behind them anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really a wait and see. I mean, itself, like a major swap participant is a new term that's never been used before. So I think you're going to see our vocabulary within the CDS market is going to evolve with the market.
I mean, this talks back to what I said in the beginning, is how the opinions from direct competitors are so different. I've had conversations and asked banks about their agency swaps trading and what they thought that would evolve, and some have said, there's no such thing, there never will be, and others have said, oh well, we're working on it and we have a plan, and they went into the details. So it's very different views, and in that same notion, how many. The other question is, how many dealers are there today and how many will there be in 2 years? And I heard there's 16 now and there'll be 10 in 2 years. And I also heard there are 25 now and there'll be 50 in 2 years. So, clearly I think all of these views are valid and they're pretty easy to argue in both ways, but clearly there's still a lot of unknowns.